When she gave birth to their black children, he threw her out. 10 years later, everything had changed. The maternity ward buzzed with activity, nurses moving between rooms. Inside one of the quieter rooms, Linda clutched her husband Thomas's hand, as a contraction ripped through her body. The pain was unbearable, but the thought of meeting her twin boys kept her pushing through. Almost there, Linda, the doctor encouraged, his voice calm. One more push. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she summoned every last bit of strength. Then, the room was filled with the sound of a baby's first cry. Linda collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air as the nurse handed her the first boy, wrapped snugly in a blanket. "He's perfect," Linda whispered, tears rolling down her face. But there was no time to savor the moment. Moments later, the second baby arrived, his cry just as strong. Exhaustion gave way to joy as Linda gazed at the tiny faces she and Thomas had created. She glanced at him, expecting to see the same wonder in his eyes, but instead, his face was clouded with confusion. His brow furrowed as he stared at their second son, whose complexion was noticeably darker. "Linda," his voice was sharp, slicing through the fragile moment. "What is this?" Linda blinked, disbelief creeping in. "What do you mean?" "There are sons." "That's not possible," Thomas hissed, his voice low but filled with venom. "Look at him." The room seemed to freeze. Linda's heart pounded in her chest. "It's genetics," she said quickly, panic rising. "You know how traits skip generations. My grandmother had darker skin." Thomas pulled his hand away, his face hardening. "Don't lie to me, Linda." The joy of the moment shattered. Thomas stormed out of the room, leaving Linda holding her newborn sons, tears of despair mingling with those of joy. The heartbreak, though, was just beginning. The ride home was nothing like Linda had imagined. Thomas was silent, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Linda, seated in the back with the twins, tried to soothe their cries while her own emotions boiled beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but fear held her back. Once they got home, Thomas wasted no time cornering her in the living room. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, voice low but sharp. "Whose children are they?" "They're not mine." Linda froze, holding the boys tight. "Thomas, they are your children," she said, her voice cracking. "How can you even ask me that?" His face twisted in anger. "Do you think I'm stupid? Look at them. Don't insult me." Linda's voice trembled as she tried to explain again, "This is about my grandmother's genes. You've seen pictures of her. This isn't something I can control." Thomas stepped back, as if even being near her was unbearable. "Get out," he said, the words cutting through her like a knife. The shock hit her like a punch to the gut. "What?" "You heard me," he spat. "Take them and go. I'll send the divorce papers." Linda's knees buckled, but she caught herself. She stared at the man she had once loved, the man she thought would always stand by her. Now, standing before her was a stranger, cold and filled with resentment. With no other choice, she packed a bag for herself and the boys. She left that same night, cradling them as they wailed in her arms. The door slammed behind her, echoing the heartbreak she felt. She moved in with her older sister in Cleveland, Ohio. The first few months were a blur, sleepless nights, endless tears, and frustration mounting with each passing day. Malik and Jordan's cries often mirrored her own. She didn't know how she would get through this, but Linda was not one to wallow. Slowly, she began to rebuild. She found a small apartment and juggled multiple jobs to make ends meet. Her days were grueling, but every time she looked at her boys, she found the strength to keep going. Malik and Jordan grew quickly. Malik was quiet, always observing, while Jordan was the life of the room, always ready with a joke. But Thomas's absence left a wound that wouldn't heal. Malik would often ask, "Why don't we have a daddy like the other kids?" Linda would force a smile and say, "We're a team." Just the three of us. That's all we need. But deep down, she knew those questions would keep coming. And she had no idea that the answers were closer than she thought. 10 years passed. Thomas had remarried, but his second marriage was strained. The guilt he carried about Linda and the boys was a silent weight, never shared with anyone, not even his new wife. He often wondered if he'd been wrong, but his pride kept him from reaching out. It wasn't until a routine checkup turned into a nightmare that Thomas's world began to unravel. Early-stage kidney failure. The news hit him hard. He'd always been healthy. "Do you have any family history of kidney issues?" the doctor asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not that I know of. My parents passed when I was young, and I was raised by my grandmother." The doctor nodded, scribbling something on his clipboard. "It might be worth looking into. Sometimes these things are hereditary." That conversation stuck with Thomas. He began digging into his family history and uncovered something that shook him to his core. A photograph of his grandmother standing beside a man with dark skin, his arm around her shoulder. On the back of the photo, June and William, 1933. William was her husband. Thomas's mind raced. His grandmother had been married to a black man. His own genetic history was far more complicated than he'd ever realized. He thought back to that day in the hospital. The accusations. He had been wrong. Thomas spent the next few weeks grappling with the enormity of his mistake. The guilt he'd suppressed for a decade roared back to life, consuming him. He had driven away the woman he loved, abandoned his children, all because of ignorance and pride. One evening, as he sat alone in his quiet house, he made a decision. It was time to find Linda. But reconnecting wouldn't be easy. He didn't even know where she was or if she would want to see him. He hired a private investigator, and weeks later, he got an address in Columbus, Ohio. He drove there, rehearsing what he wanted to say 1,000 times. But now, standing at the door, his mind went blank. The house was small but well kept, with a basketball hoop in the driveway and a garden full of flowers. He imagined the life Linda had built here, a life he hadn't been part of. He rang the doorbell. Linda appeared, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. When she saw him, her face froze. For a moment, neither spoke. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of shock and caution. "I need to talk to you," Thomas said, his voice shaky.